Okay, so on my last video about the Machaira general purpose rifle, I promised that I would do a video on scopes. And I did that because I knew that it would be a lot bigger of a topic. Well, as I started putting this video together, I realized it's a huge topic. I'm not even sure I can adequately cover it, and it's going to end up being a long video. Sorry. If you stick to the end, though, I am going to go over some specific scope recommendations. But before that, I'm going to go into talking about the different characteristics of scopes and how that fits into the general purpose concept and things that you can be looking for when you're setting up yours. So when you're setting up a scope for anything, you first of all have to define what it is you expect to be able to do with this rifle and scope combination. If you are a hog hunter that hunts over at night, you're going to have a set of criteria for what is important to you. That's going to be different than the guy setting up for a Montana elk hunt, which is going to be different than a guy setting up for groundhogs. It's going to be different for the guy that's doing, PRS style shooting or 3-gun matches or combat shooting or any of that. So each of those types of specialty scopes are matched around those specific skills and those specific tasks. The idea with this, though, is to be able to have one scope that does it all. It might not be the best for any one of those. In fact, it probably isn't the best for any one of those, but it works pretty well for all of them. So that's what I went into for this. And so starting off on this was a pretty big task. And so I kind of narrowed it down. I said, well, what are the things that will help me understand what characteristics are going to work for this? So I picked really 3 different scenarios. The snapshot at 10 yards. I considered that important because that simulates, that rapid target where you have to throw the gun up and get it on quickly. That is important with both combat shooting and with hunting if you're walking out and a deer jumps out in front of you, things like that. So that was number 1. Number 2, I wanted to be able to engage a 2 MOA target out to 1,000 yards. That was really kind of arbitrary, but that's where I went with it. That's what I said, if it can handle long range, and I had to define what I meant by long range. So a 2 MOA target at 1,000 yards. And number 3 is the fact that I hunt woodlands of Virginia, and most of the hunting that I do, most of the deer that I end up seeing are right at the edge of darkness. Legal hunting light is from a half an hour before sunrise to a half an hour after sunset. The 10 minutes at the extreme edges of both of those are where you see most of the deer. So I wanted a scope that I could see a target, see a deer in the woods out to 200 yards. So that's really what I was trying to make sure that it could do. I figured if it could handle those 3 things, the short range, the long range, and the intermediate range in low light, if it could handle those 3, everything else is going to kind of fill in between it. And that's where I went with it. So where do you start? You have a lot of different things to consider. You have magnification range, elevation adjustment, turret types, objectives, weight, all of that. Those are all considerations. Where do you start? I don't know, because a lot of those are just overlapping. Some things, some of the decisions you make about one aspect are going to influence decisions on another. So I'm just going to start off with magnification range. So this scope that I have here is a Night Force SHV. It is the 3-10. I set 3 power as the minimum magnification I wanted for this scope. And I base that on the fact that in the scout rifle classes that I've taken and practical rifles and a lot of the drills that I've done, I've found that 2 to 2.5 power is pretty ideal in allowing me to keep both eyes open for a snapshot. Gun comes up, and with both eyes open, it allows me to focus through the scope and get on target rapidly. 2 to 2.5 power is ideal. I've tried 1 to 1.5 power, and honestly, for me, it didn't make that big of a difference. So you might be different. You might need something of a lower power. But for me, 2 to 2.5 power worked great. 3 works, but that's the absolute maximum. That is a hard stop on 3 power. So that's the low end. On the top end, I started looking at it and realized that the U.S. military has been used the Leupold Mark IV fixed 10 power scope as their sniper rifle from, I believe it was 1987 or thereabouts, all the way up through 2014. So 2 invasions of Iraq, 1 invasion of Afghanistan, and the bulk of the global war on terror was done with snipers using 10 power scopes. So I know that I can see a 2 MOA target quite well out to 1,000 yards. I can actually see a bit smaller than that out to 1,000 yards. So 10 power works. Would a 12 or 15 power work better? Maybe. Could you get away with an 8 or a 9 power? Probably. But if you're going to drop down to 8, you better have some really, really clear, good quality optics. I kind of like the 10 as the for the top end as a minimum, but you can figure out what works there. A lot of people look at it and say, well, I mean, there's 3 to 18s out there. Well, yes, there are, but have you seen how much they weigh? And that's the next consideration, the weight of the scope. This is a pretty compact scope. There's a reason for that. This is not a rifle to be carried in a backpack or on a mule or in your 4-wheeler. This is a gun to be carried in the field and carried in a manner in which you can use it at an instant's notice. If you're going out to your hunting field and it's early afternoon, you're heading to your deer stand, this thing shouldn't be slung over your shoulder. You should be walking out there ready to go. If a deer pops up, you need to be able to get into position for it. Well, you can't do that if you have a 12, 15, 18 pound rifle. So you need to start shaving weight. And one of the places you can save weight is in the scope. I really wanted to get a 20 ounce or lighter limit. I wasn't able to do that. The SHV comes in at about 22.5 ounces. It works. It's at the upper end of what I would want. I would say 24 is probably the max. That's where I would set it. Of course, you're going to have your own priorities, but I would recommend setting a maximum weight limit because there's a lot of scopes out there that look pretty good, but man, you're talking about putting 30, 32 ounces on top of a rifle. It's too much. 2 pounds on top of the rifle is just too much. 24 ounces, I would say, is a hard stop for me. Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room, focal plane. If you are starting into long-range shooting or looking at long-range shooting at all, you know the answer to the question. Front focal plane is preferred, isn't it? Well, the long-range shooters will tell you it absolutely is, and they are absolutely right for their application. Their application is a scope that has a very high top-end magnification, 18, 20 power, sometimes up to 30 power scopes. If you have a 25 power scope and you're out and you see a target at 450 yards, well, you're not going to be at 25 power. You're going to pull that back to whatever you need to be able to see the target and see enough of field of view around it to have good situational awareness about what is around that target. And when you do that, you've just changed the reticle markings on your scope. Well, not if you have front focal plane. Front focal plane, the reticle changes size with magnification. So the scale of the wind holes are going to be accurate and correct at any magnification. That's pretty important. But what if your top-end magnification is only 10 power? If your top-end magnification is only 10 power, well, your reticle is going to be correct at 10 power. It won't be correct at 6 power. It won't be correct at 5 or 4 or 3. But does that matter? When are you going to be at less than 10 power? Well, you'll be at less than 10 power if there's a target at 200 yards, it's at 200 yards, yeah, you're going to pull it back. You're not going to be at 10 power. At 200 yards, do you need to know what your wind hold is? You don't. You really don't. The bullet's not in the air long enough for it to make that big of a difference. It'll make some difference, but not enough to where you're going to be holding for that based on your reticle. So a second focal plane scope is going to have some real advantage for you. It's going to be accurate at maximum magnification, which is where you need it. Maximum magnification is only 10 power, so dropping back to 6 or 8, not going to hurt you. But what are the advantages to a second focal plane scope? And there are some. And it has to do with the fact that the scale on those things, those little tiny lines that show you what the MOA or mil scale is, once you drop down below about 4 or 5 power, they get really fuzzy. I mean, it gets everything blends together because it's so stinking small. You can't see it that well in the glass. So by the time you get down to 3 power, you're looking at just a fuzzy line for your crosshairs. It can work. It can work, but it's not ideal at those lower magnifications. A second focal plane scope, you don't have to deal with that. While we're talking about this, let's talk about reticle design, because that plays into what type of focal plane system you get. So I'm going to show you a couple of reticle designs here. So this is the reticle on this Night Force. This is it's an MOA scale, and you can see it shows me the scale of MOA, 10 MOA, 20 MOA, down here all the way down to 30 MOA. So I can do 30 MOA elevation holds. So that's what that scope looks like. Let me show you, this is the Athlon website. This is the Helos BTR Gen 2 2-12. This is what this reticle looks like at 12 power. The mill markings are very, very clear. You can see them nicely. Well, let's see what that looks like at 2 power. At 2 power, that gets pretty fuzzy, doesn't it? Now picture this is not a nice white background and you're not shooting at a target, but you're now shooting at a deer standing against a wood line. Yeah, that's illuminated. I don't know if it's illuminated brightly, but whether it's illuminated or not, it'll just be an illuminated fuzzy line. So that can work still, but you notice it has these heavy duplex lines that stayed in the field of view. That does draw your attention in towards the center of the scope. Okay, that helps a lot. That's something to take into consideration. Here's one of their other scopes. This is a 1-10, and again, this is at 10 power. It's a front focal plane. Again, you can see all the markings. You can see the heavy duplexes out here. But now watch what happens when we drop down to 2 power on this thing. Those duplex lines don't go all the way to the edge of the scope. That is all you're going to see in the center of your field of view. If that is what you see and you're trying to line up on a deer at 80 yards away, I'm not sure that would work real well. So that's something to keep in mind when you are looking at reticles. Pay attention to the reticle design. If it is a front focal plane, make sure those duplex lines are going to go all the way to the edge. Understand that it's going to get a little fuzzy for that centered crosshair at those lower magnifications. So front focal plane absolutely is the right answer for the long range guys. Might not be such a big deal and might actually be counterproductive in this general purpose type of rifle setup. So next thing, elevation limits. I ran into this one bit me, but when you are looking at scope specifications online, one of the things you need to keep in mind is how much elevation does it allow? And they'll tell you in the specifications the limit of elevation, the internal adjustment range. And it'll be like 70 MOA or 90 or 100 MOA of internal elevation. Well, if it says that, cut that in half. So for instance, if it says that you have 90 MOA of total internal adjustment, it comes shipped from the factory, allowing you to adjust 45 up and 45 down. So now you've got 45 MOA worth of adjustment. if you have a short barrel 308 like this, to get out to 1,000 yards, you need about 45 MOA, give or take, depending on if it's right at 1,000 or just over 1,000. Bullets and all that make a difference there too, but let's say roughly 45 MOA. Well, that means you have no room for error. When you mount that on the gun, you better not have to adjust up to MOA just to get your 100 yard zero, or you can't do 1,000 yards. There's a way to fix that though, and you can fix it pretty easily, even going down to one that has 70 MOA. So if it has 70 MOA total adjustment, that's 35 up and 35 down. Well, that's not enough, is it? Well, you can put on either a 20 MOA base, or in my case, what I've done is 20 MOA rings, which builds in 20 MOA worth of cant to the scope. What that does is if it has 70 MOA of adjustment, that would normally be 35 up and 35 down. Well, now it's 55 up and 15 down. Well, that's cool. You don't need much downward adjustment. That's just for zeroing and changing loads. But now you have 55 MOA of upward adjustment. That works. You can get away with 70 MOA total adjustment range as long as you have a 20 MOA base and you're limiting yourself to that 1,000 yards. This scope here was advertised at 90 MOA. I actually tested it, has 102 MOA internal. Plus I have the rings. I can actually take this out over 1,200 yards because I've got plenty of adjustment range built in. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is Loophole does something really weird with their zero stop system. They limit the adjustment range of the turret caps. So on this one, I can adjust this thing as many turns as I want. On the Loophole, you're limited, and depending on which model you're looking at, either 1 or 2, or in some cases 3 turns of the turret. So they'll tell you what the turret adjustment limit is. Well, most of theirs are 30 MOA of total turret adjustment. That's not enough. It won't get you out to 1,000 yards. Some of their scopes have a 3 turn, and those will do the trick, but the 2 turns will not. So pay attention, not just to the total adjustment range, but also the turret adjustment range. While we are on turrets, let's talk about zero stops. You need one. You need one very badly. This scope didn't come with one, but I'm going to show you it was not hard to make one. So I got this scope because I couldn't afford the next level up. So I made this thing. This is a piece of 3/4 inch conduit that I cut and then sanded down to exactly the height that I needed. It slips right over that. And then make sure I'm zeroed. Almost done. There we go. And now my zero stop is set. So yeah, you can do a homemade zero stop, but you need a zero stop. And why do you need a zero stop? If you're coming from the hunting world, you may not fully appreciate this, but let's say you're shooting a match, and honestly, you should shoot a match. After you take a class, learn the gun, learn what you're doing, take it to a match, find out how good what you've learned really is. You're not going to be competitive. You're not going to win. You're going to learn. You're going to learn your equipment. You're going to learn the limits of your equipment, the weaknesses of your equipment, and the weaknesses of your training, and figure out how to do things better. So do a match. But in a match, you may have a stage where you have targets at 900, and then the next one is at 480, and then the next one at 620, and then the next one at 840. Okay, so you're dialing this thing furiously between targets. I guarantee you're going to forget how many times you turned that little sucker. So just turn it back to the 0 and start over again. It's the only way, and you need a zero stop. So that's one thing to keep in mind. All right, let's see. Reticle design. Oh, MRad versus MOA. So milliradians, mils, versus MOA. I got so off in the weeds about this when I started. I thought I had to have MRad. Everybody's using MRad, right? Well, yeah, the long-range shooting community is. They've kind of standardized on it. And if you're going to be hanging out with those guys a lot, and you got a lot of buddies that are doing it, it's worth it. But if you find the right scope and it's got everything else right, don't worry about it. MOA and Mills both measure angles. They measure them, and angles are angles. It just is a difference in how those angles are subtended. MOA tends to be easier if you are used to dealing in inches. So some long-range hunters prefer MOA reticles because they can use the reticle to figure out the size of a trophy. You know, if they're looking at, they want to see, oh, does that elk have, 24-inch inside spread? Well, he's 600 yards away. Okay, well, how many MOA is that? It's a real easy calculation. So they just can use the fact that MOA translates into inches pretty easily to figure that out without doing any type of conversion. MRad, on the other hand, is just what all the competitive shooters are using. So advantages both ways, but don't get caught in the woods. They both work. They're both fine. Reticle, illuminated reticle. I have hunted enough at dawn and dusk that I know that reticles disappear at about 15 minutes after sunset. I wanted an illuminated reticle, and I think it's an important feature. I think it's one that, if that is missing, you're going to be missing out on a lot. Okay, those are the features. Now, let's talk about a couple of recommendations real quick. This is the Nightforce SHV. I like this scope. It works, but there's a couple of shortcomings that I've discussed already. Little on the heavy side, no zero stop. I had to add an aftermarket throw lever. The NXS has all the features that this one has. It's 2 ounces lighter. It's a 2.5 to 10, so you get a little bit better on the bottom end of the range. It's a little bit lighter weight, and the reticle is illuminated both green and red. You can select it in the field. So that's a better scope, but it also costs $600 more. So that, right now, I think that's probably the best in the market. Loophole just came out with an amazing scope. They just introduced it at SHOT Show. It's the Mark V 2 to 10. I looked at that in a gun store the other day. That thing is amazing. Now it's a little over 24 ounces, just, I think it's 24.2 or something like that. But the thing costs $2,500. It's built like a tank. It's bright. It's wonderful. But geez, $2,500. A little bit more budget friendly is one that I was showing you a few minutes ago. That was the Athlon, the Helos BTR Gen 2 2 to 12. Vortex makes the Viper PST. That would work. And you might be wondering about LPVOs. I looked at LPVOs. The problem with most LPVOs is the reticle. The reticle just doesn't work. They don't have, a lot of them have built-in bullet drop compensators. These BDCs, you're not going to use a BDC. That's good for combat. It's not good for precision. It just doesn't work. And they also don't have wind holds on most of the reticles, at least not enough of them. There's one out there that really does, and it is the Swamp Fox Arrowhead 1 to 10. That thing is a $500 scope. It has all the features I just listed, plus some. It's got plenty of adjustment range. It has a locking zero stop turret. It's got illumination. You can choose red or green. You have to order it in one color or the other. It's got it all. I am just a little distrustful of Chinese-made glass. I can't bring myself to it. That one looks like it could be a real winner, but everything else that I looked at, it was either the reticle wasn't right, the adjustments weren't right, something just wasn't right on every other LPVO that I looked at. But it's something to consider, and it might work out for you. If you have used a Swamp Fox 1 to 10, I'd love to hear from you. So that's the deal with the LPVO. I think I've covered as much as I can in a video that people will watch part of, I hope. I do appreciate you watching, and if you have any questions, put them in the comment section. I'll answer them as I can. And if you have any other requests about different videos that I can do regarding this Machaira project, let me know. I'm always open to figuring out new material. Thank you for watching.